Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Germany says it needs up to 50 to 60,000 more troops to meet NATO targets amid Russia's threat. Meanwhile, the US Defense Chief Hegseth warns allies not to rely solely on America, pushes for 5% of their GDP as a military spending deal. US President Donald Trump has reinstated a travel ban targeting 12 countries, citing national security concerns. The ban takes effect on 9th June at 12:01 a.m. EDT and applies to nationals from Afghanistan, Myanmar, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. A Russian drone attack has killed 5 and injured 24 in Chernihiv, northern Ukraine, according to the Ukrainian officials, while Donald Trump said Putin promised to respond to Ukraine's drone strike after their call. Meanwhile, Russia will repair damage done to the warplanes from Operation Spiderweb. The United States has vetoed a draft UN Security Council resolution that demanded an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Meanwhile, Gaza aid remains on hold. Sites, including Rafah, remain closed for unspecified maintenance, affecting Gaza residents who rely on aid. China warned the European Union to stop provoking trouble in the southern China Sea after EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas criticized Beijing's coercive actions in the region. A Chinese embassy spokesperson in Manila urged the EU to respect China's territorial claims and maritime rights. Meanwhile, the Philippines and the US militaries conducted their 7th joint sail. Syria has agreed to give the International Atomic Energy Agency access to suspected former nuclear sites. The move comes amid reports of the killing of several people from the Alawite minority by security checkpoint personnel. President Trump has suspended the entry of international students studying at Harvard for an initial 6 months. The proclamation cited national security concerns as the reason for the suspension amid an ongoing feud between the U.S. administration and the Ivy League school. South Korea's new leader Lee Jae-myung has held his first cabinet meeting after decisively winning a snap presidential election. The meeting focused on an emergency package to address economic uncertainty and to aid households. NATO defense ministers are meeting today to lay crucial groundwork ahead of this month's high-stakes summit in The Hague. Reportedly, the meeting in Hague would discuss increasing members' yearly fiscal contributions for defense spending, membership status for current and future members, as well as plans to bolster NATO defense capabilities in the future. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has reinforced President Trump's push for a dramatic boost in defense spending across the alliance, urging NATO members to commit 5% of their GDP, up from the current 2% target. Hegseth expressed confidence that all allies will align with Trump's demand before the June 24 to 25th summit in Hague. He also called for an end to the reliance on America. Let's take a listen.
I'm here is to make sure every country in NATO understands every shoulder has to be to the plow. Every country has to contribute at that level of 5% as a recognition of the nature of the threat. But our message is going to continue to be clear. It's deterrence and peace through strength, but it can't be reliance. It cannot and will not be reliance. To be an alliance, you got to be more than flags. You got to be formations. You got to be more than conferences. You need to be combat-ready capabilities. So we're here to continue the work that President Trump started, which is a commitment to 5% defense spending across this alliance, which we think will happen, which we think has to happen by the summit at The Hague later this month.
Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said he expects allies to agree today on what he called historic new capability targets, the targets which define how many troops and weapons and how much ammunition a country needs to provide to NATO, would aim to better balance defense contributions between Europe, Canada, the United States, and enhance NATO's overall readiness and firepower, and also make this alliance stronger and more lethal. Rutte has also floated a compromise promising 3.5% for core defense and an additional 1.5% for broader security-related investments. Let's take a listen to what Mark Rutte had to say.
It will be an important meeting of defense ministers. It is the last big meeting we will have before the summit in The Hague, and today is really key because we will decide on the capability targets. And this is an important building block to decide on the money we're going to spend in the coming years on defense. That will be a considerable extra investment. And this is why I predict that in The Hague we will decide on a much higher spending target for all the nations in NATO. Because we have to invest in our air defense systems, we have to invest in our let's say long-range missiles, we have to invest in our maneuverable land formations, command and control systems. All of this has to happen. And these mean huge investments. We need all over NATO territory. And by the way, doing this will also equalize what we are spending with what the United States is spending. We, Canada and Europe, equalizing with the US. And we know this is important because we want a fairer NATO where all our allies
In a significant move, Ukraine's defense minister has announced that Kyiv will receive up to 1.3 billion euros from its allies next year to ramp up domestic weapons production, marking a major show of continued support amid the ongoing war. Germany, for its part, says it will need to add as many as 60,000 active troops to meet new NATO benchmarks. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius insisted the alliance must clearly name Russia as its greatest threat in the upcoming summit declaration. Now we have two guests joining us, Keith Vaz, former UK Minister from London, and Dr. Satoru Nagao. He's a fellow Hudson Institute from Tokyo, Japan. Thank you for joining us today. So Mr. Watts, what are the primary objectives of the NATO defense ministers meeting in Brussels ahead of the upcoming summit in The Hague?
Well, I think that we are in a very dangerous situation now, in the sense of what the Americans expect the European countries to do. On the one hand, they're asking for an increase in defense expenditure well over what they're currently spending. And on the other hand, these EU countries and some of the other European countries like Britain are being hit by the Americans with tariffs. So what is the objective here? Is it actually to try and work with allies, or is it to make it impossible for this alliance to actually succeed? These are big questions that are going to have to be answered at the NATO summit. All these countries are facing grave domestic issues that they need to contend with. Now they're being asked to increase expenditure. To be fair to President Trump, this is what he has always said. I think what needs to happen now is the European nations need to work together to see what kind of European initiative they can put together, because they're certainly not going to be able to afford an increase in defense expenditure to the amount that the Americans want, at the same time grappling with these huge increases in tariffs that President Trump announced only this week. They've been put in an impossible situation. I feel sorry for Mark Rutte. He's been a prime minister himself, so he knows the pressure on domestic budgets. It's going to be very tough for them to meet these kinds of spending limits. It's just not going to happen. And something's got to give in the end. Either the alliance is going to fall to pieces under this stress, or the Americans are going to have to back down. It can't be both.
Right, and now on to you, Dr. Nagao. How are NATO member states responding to proposals for increased defense spending, including the suggested 5% of the GDP target?
Currently, the European countries try to catch up, adjust demand from the United States. But indeed, for a long time, they haven't catched up. The demand came from the United States because indeed the history of the demand from the United States, which did ask the European country to increase the defense spending, is indeed it had started in the end of the Obama administration. So Obama administration, first Trump administration, 4 years the Biden administration, and now the first year of the Trump administration, second time. For a long time, the United States continued to demand to increase European defense budget, but it hasn't reached a certain level. So unfortunately, view from the United States, European country need to increase the defense budget more, and finally they have started to show seriousness to reply to this demand. Why this is very important? Because the United States want to withdraw from Europe and concentrate the effort to China in the Indo-Pacific. So that's why in this case, European security rely on the European countries that is needed. And in this case, despite Russia's aggression to Ukraine has started, despite such kind of situation, still the European defense industry hasn't provided enough number of ammunition to Ukraine. That is very serious problem because European security, which is serious for Europe, not the United States, not other country. So most important serious problem, the Russia's aggression to Ukraine, is Europe's problem mainly. So that's why Europeans must increase the defense budget and try to be strong and try to prepare enough support for Ukraine. That is very important. But generally, the production line demands 3 years to produce many ammunition or many weapons. So this year is 4th year since Russia's aggression started. So despite this, not enough level of the defense industry each European country hasn't achieved. So that is unfortunately each European need to be serious. That is the situation, I believe. Thank you.
And now, with that in mind, Sir Watts, what do you think will be the impact of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war on NATO spending?
Well, it's a very good question, Asma, because the fact is the European nations themselves are helping the Ukraine independently of NATO. Each countries, such as my own, United Kingdom, have pledged additional support for Ukraine irrespective of NATO. So this is happening anyway. And that is why probably there will be a feeling in Brussels that it's perhaps about time, and The Hague, that perhaps it's about time that Europe steps up itself and provides these capabilities without having to rely on the Americans. Which is why only this week, Keir Starmer in the UK announced more munitions factories being built in the United Kingdom itself. So rather than use your money to buy American weapons, you use your money on your own domestic economies and spend that money yourselves. But the Ukraine war would never have continued as long as it has without the support of individual NATO countries helping President Zelensky. And without their help, it just would not, we would not be there today. So it's interesting to hear from the Americans. I think it's going to be a tough meeting. It's not going to be easy. And I don't think the European countries are going to be able to come up with this money. There just isn't enough money there. European taxpayers don't have this kind of resources available. And that is why we've always relied on the Americans. That's what the alliance is all about. It's an alliance to deal with outside threats. And that means in an alliance, not everyone pays the same. People pay different amounts of money. So let's see, what is in America's strategic interests? Is it the defense of Europe as a way of defending America? Or are they just going to step back and allow the Europeans to do this themselves? So these are crucial times. And that's why it's important to consider very carefully what the consequences of what Pete Hegseth is going to ask for.
And now, switching focus for a moment to the outcomes, Dr. Nagao, how might the outcomes of these meetings influence NATO's approach to collective defense and global security challenges?
The United States continue to support Ukraine, that is true, but because the United States do not have the will to lose the war in Ukraine. But at the same time, Europeans should share more security burden with the United States. That is the opinion of the United States. Because the last 3 years, the US continues to support European countries, and the view from the United States, Europeans rely too much on the United States. Because the United States, China is the main threat now. So need to deal with China. In this case, United States needs the money to catch up the effort from China. China is building more than 100 warships at the same time now. So last 1 decade, 148 ships China inducted. This is the same size of Japan's maritime self-defense force or Indian Navy. So such kind of rapid military modernization is happening in the Indo-Pacific. So under such kind of situation, if the United States need to share the heavy burden in Europe, United States cannot catch up to such kind of rapid changing situation in the Pacific. So that's why not only Europe, but also the Middle East or Afghanistan, other areas, the US want to withdraw and share the security burden with local allies. But European hasn't prepared enough in the past. So that's why today, European shows strong will to be strong. So that is good news for the United States. And so that's why the consequence, the view from consequence, if the European will be very strong, that is a very good consequence for the United States too.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satoru Nagao and Sir Keith Vaz for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on to our next story. Israeli forces have recovered the bodies of 2 hostages held by Hamas in a special operation in Khan Yunis, Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed the victims as Judy Weinstein Haggai and her husband, Gad Haggai. Their bodies have been returned to Israel. Authorities say 56 hostages remain in Hamas's custody, with fewer than half believed to be still alive. Judy Weinstein, aged 70, and her husband Gad Haggai, aged 72, were longtime residents of Kibbutz Nir Oz, near the Gaza border. They were killed during Hamas' October 7th attack while out for a morning walk. Weinstein, a New York-born teacher, and Haggai, a retired chef and a musician, leave behind 4 children and 7 grandchildren. On the international front, the United States has vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution also urged unrestricted aid access and the release of hostages, but the US called it a non-starter without a link to hostage release. Meanwhile, GHF aid sites in Gaza remain closed amid repairs after deadly Israeli strikes near Rafah. Israel warns roads to sites are now combat zones as the humanitarian crisis worsens. Now we have guest Peter Baum. He's a foreign editor from Weekly Blitz, joining us live from London. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. How might the recovery of the hostage bodies affect efforts to secure the release of remaining captives in Gaza?
Yes, now naturally the IDF managed to obtain the bodies of these 2 victims who were brutally slaughtered by Hamas, and that could have only been done through their own network of Shin Bet, who must have received the information from Hamas operatives whom they have captured. Now clearly this is to be welcomed But as you quite rightly pointed out, there are still a number of hostages, many of whom are dead, whom the Israeli public want the Israeli government to retrieve from captivity. And it is this one issue, I assure you and all your viewers and listeners, that if Hamas were to have released all the hostages, whether it was immediately after October the 7th or before now, this ghastly war in Gaza would have been brought to an end, and there would have been no need for the UN Security Council resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire, because the ceasefire will only happen once all the hostages have been released. Of that, I have no doubt. There is one other thing. There were some rumours a couple of days ago, even a couple of weeks ago, that the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration were not seeing eye to eye with each other, and that there was much press reports about Trump changing his mind about support for Netanyahu. I think we can see quite clearly, given the veto that the US imposed yesterday on the Security Council resolution, that that is not the case, and in fact Trump is fully committed to supporting the Netanyahu's policy.
And Peter, let's dive a little bit deeper into that. What are the broader implications of the US veto on the UN ceasefire resolution for diplomatic efforts in the region, according to you?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think the many members of the UN Security Council actually support what Trump and Netanyahu are doing, but cannot be seen to do so diplomatically. And therefore, they actually understand that the US will veto any such similar resolution. So behind the scenes, Israel's allies, and I include the United Kingdom and France, despite their recent anti-Netanyahu rhetoric, are secretly pleased that Israel are continuing with this war in Gaza, but because they face domestic pressure, so they cannot be seen to be supporting Israel, although behind the scenes they do. Now, as long as Hamas continue with their stubbornness, this state of affairs will continue. That's the way it is, because the objective now of the Netanyahu government, and the only way he can be stopped, is by domestic pressure internally within Israel. The objective of the Netanyahu government is to completely destroy, two objectives: to have all the hostages released, and to completely destroy Hamas militarily. And I think one goes hand in hand with the other.
Thank you very much, Peter Baum, for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we have a breaking news. In the wake of the phone call that has taken place between the US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Putin, Kremlin has now come out confirming many of the details. The Kremlin has stated that Russia will respond how and when to the recent Ukrainian operation called Spiderweb. Kremlin has also accused Ukraine of terrorism for allegedly ordering the destruction of a bridge over a railway. President Putin further informed Donald Trump of a planned response, but no face-to-face meeting has been agreed. The Kremlin noted a meeting is necessary, but must be properly prepared. Now we move on to Asia. China has urged the European Union to stop provoking trouble in the South China Sea, following a visit by the EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas to the Philippines. The Chinese embassy in Manila criticized the EU for interfering in the disputed waterway, emphasizing that the bloc has no right to intervene. China also advised the Philippines to avoid relying on external forces to resolve disputes, urging Manila to return dialogue and consultation with Beijing. The EU and the Philippines have jointly expressed concern over China's activities in the South China Sea, calling them illegal and coercive. China claims sovereignty over nearly the entire South China Sea, including areas within the exclusive economic zones of several Southeast Asian nations. This comes after the EU and the Philippines agreed to initiate talks on defense and security to tackle cyber attacks, foreign interference, and ensure regional stability. During the meeting, Kaja Kallas emphasized the EU's commitment to addressing concerns in the South China Sea. Now we have Andrew KP Long. He's a China strategist. He's joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you for joining us today. How might recent EU-Philippines security talks impact the geopolitical balance in the South China Sea?
South China Sea is no ordinary theater for geopolitics. If you look at the South China Sea, the importance to China is overwhelming. Not only as 0% contested areas or territories of sovereignty, but it is also a existential conduit for external trade on which China heavily depends. Not only trade, but also import of raw materials, goods, and also foodstuff and energy resources, on which the almost entirety of China's economy and the livelihood of its people depend. Now, the second reason why the South China Sea is important is because, again, apart from the disputed territories with a lot of neighbors, it is used by the United States as a theater to contain and to box China in. And if you look at the American assets in the South China Sea, you will see that there are two so-called island chains. And there is first of all, the first island chain centered on Okinawa with a lot of American assets and airplanes and also battleships, but also the second island chain centered in Guam. Again, different American assets. So if you look at the map, this is the United States encirclement of China. And again, as I just said, the South China Sea is an important conduit for the economy, for the livelihood of its people. And that's why you can understand the strength of China's defense of its interests. Now, looking about the contested territories, you've got to go back a long, long time. And even though the claimants, different claimants, even though there's certain islands or certain areas which they consider their own, apart from China, they are really involved some sort of unilateral action maybe decades ago when no one cared about these islands or territories. But now the situation is pushed to the fore. Now, the third dimension we have to understand is that the relationship between the Philippines and China is shifting and changing depending on different Philippine government. The current government is very anti-China and pro the United States, but the previous government, the third, is the other way around. And then the government before then third, again, is anti-China. And then if you go back further, the previous government, the fourth government before now, is also pro-China. So I think that the Philippines relationship is chopping and changing, but at the moment they're aligning the Philippines' territorial interests with the United States containment of China, along with American allies, for example, the Quad, including India and Australia and then Japan. So you can see that a very problematic area which can lend itself to escalation. And that's why in the ASEAN countries, most of the ASEAN countries, Singapore and the Malaysia, Indonesia, some of them also have territorial disputes, but they prefer to deal with them through diplomacy and through developing the so-called conduct the code of conduct for navigations in the South China Sea. Now, the code of conduct is still being negotiated, but there's some progress has been made. But it's much better than confrontation, because confrontation has a tendency for escalation. And of course, China's interest in the South China Sea is not only territory, not only trade, but also the situation in Taiwan. And the Taiwan situation, now led by a pro-independence leader, backed by the United States, is again adds to the instability. So I think that it behoves all countries to deal with this, not in isolation, but in a broader context, and to seek a method which is more amenable to maintaining stability, and rather than hyping the rhetoric, which can lead to a security spiral, which could well result in unwanted wars or unwanted consequences.
Thank you very much, Andrew K.P. Leung, for joining us today and sharing that insight. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.